Can everybody hear me? There are handouts in the back if you haven't gotten one of the slides, and you may want to get one. I had the pleasure of first meeting Dr. Chris McCarty when I worked on policy issues at the Bureau of Economic and Business Research, among other center affiliations I had at the University of Florida before I retired. Dr. McCarty is a professor of anthropology and director of the UF Bureau of Economic and Business Research at the University of Florida. He has over 30 years of experience conducting research in Florida, both at the state and local levels, and under his direction, BEBR, that's the acronym for the Bureau, has implemented the most comprehensive economic and demographic database on Florida. He is regarded as an expert on the Florida economy and often speaks to groups around the state on that topic. Dr. McCarty's primary research focus is on social network analysis, and more specifically, the analysis of personal networks. More recently, he developed a network science program funded through the UF Clinical and Transitional Science Institute. Dr. McCarty and his colleagues use networks to understand what drives scientific collaboration and how interventions can be developed to provide incentives for new collaborations. Dr. McCarty will talk about the Consumer Sentiment Index and its predictive capabilities for the economy. However, to set the context for that part of the presentation, he will talk more broadly about what is happening to the economy. So please welcome Dr. McCarty. Thank you, Chris.
Do I use this one? I guess so. All right. Whoa. You're going to control it. All right. Thanks for having me here. So I was asked to do a talk on consumer sentiment, which this will be, but I decided it was too boring if I started off with consumer sentiment. So I'm going to flip it and talk a lot about the context of consumer sentiment. I promise you by the end I'll get to it, but I think it's more important to just talk about the drivers. So let's see, which button am I pressing to advance? I thought I did. Whoops. Okay, there we go. Okay, I usually like to begin the talks talking a little bit about BEBR, Bureau of Economic and Business Research, where Lynne used to work with us. It is among the oldest, I think it's actually the oldest center on campus. It was established in 1929. You can see that's our window on our offices. We've got a suite of offices in the Ayers Plaza. So any of you who've been in Gainesville for a while, you would know it as the buildings with all the medical condominiums, which are now not there, servicing Alachua General, which is also not there. So the university and the city turned it into an innovation district, and that's where we are. So we were founded in 1929. If you do the math, we're looking forward to our 100th anniversary in 2029, and my plan is to try and stick around until then. It was established oddly in the College of Journalism back in 1929, but it quickly moved to the College of Business. We were there until 2011, and then we moved to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, where we are now. We currently have 4 programs, so over a almost 100-year history, the programs have changed a bit. So currently we have an economic analysis program, population studies, social network analysis, and survey research. And we have been doing a lot of internships. So we work a lot with undergraduates now. And actually, if you have the handout on the front of the slide, the middle person is an undergraduate economics intern. So briefly, economic analysis. We now have just one economist, Hector Sandoval. He does a lot of ad hoc work, a lot of work with cities, counties, a lot of healthcare economics, and he also does economic impact studies. The population unit has been around since the early 1970s, and since that time, we have had a contract with the state of Florida to do the estimates and projections. So anytime anybody wants to build something in Florida where they need to cite a population number for a city, a county, unincorporated area, they use the BEBR estimates. They also do projections by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin per the state's request. And then we do geospatial mapping, so we can build up parcels into whatever geography you want and apply the projections to them. The network thing really comes out of my research. So I'm originally from West Virginia. I went to West Virginia University, and as an undergraduate, ran into somebody who got me into networks, and I've done it ever since. So we did get a fairly large grant from the NIH through the Clinical and Translational Science Institute. And that ball that you see up there on the upper right is what would be called the main component in a network. So that's the University of Florida's main component in 2022. And those things are colored by discipline. The dots represent researchers. The lines represent collaborations. So at UF, people can publish together. They can get on grants together, on patents together. And so that represents how UF collaborates or doesn't. We've actually worked with a math graduate student who did, he's a topologist, so he looked for holes. So it's been a very useful thing. And then finally, the Survey Center. It's been around since the mid-70s. It has always had that consumer sentiment index as an anchor for our monthly survey, which we still do. Mostly we do contract work, a lot of it with the state. We have a very large telephone survey lab, 93 stations, so people are still doing telephone surveys. We also do in-person postal surveys and on a variety of topics. So most of Beaver is really what we make through contracts and grants, and we do pretty well. So, inflation. Anybody who's listened to the news, you've heard about inflation. So what is inflation? Inflation is typically measured by, there's several measures, but the one that you probably hear about most is called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So that is a basket of goods. So you see that shopping cart over there on the right, and imagine that it has a bottle of ketchup and a jar of relish and a head of lettuce, you know, some meat, some cereal boxes, an iPhone, a Toyota Corolla, an apartment, right? All of which won't fit in the basket. But that's what it is. The Bureau of Labor Statistics identifies a set of goods that they track around the country, and that's what the CPI is. They do change the basket occasionally, but not a lot, because if you change it all the time, you don't know why it's changing. Is it changing because the goods that you've changed or because prices are actually changing? So they are very judicious. They don't change it very often, but you know, maybe there's not so much cream of wheat in there and there's an iPhone in there. Personal Consumption Expenditure Index is another basket of goods. It's a wider set of goods, and this is the one that the Federal Reserve that I'm going to talk about in a second, they really track that. That's the one that they're primarily interested in when they decide whether they need to respond. The PPI, the Producer Price Index, is the selling prices received by domestic producers for their output. So you can think of it as inflation among the people who make things or services. Services are also in there, right? So the Producer Price Index reflects inflation among people who make things. Okay, so this is the CPI. You're going to see a lot of graphs that look like this. There's going to be this white background, and then you see these gray bars. Those gray bars are recessions. So many of us remember the recession of the 70s. That was an oil crisis-driven recession. We had another recession in the mid-70s. Many of you may remember the double-dip recessions of the 80s. That's when your mortgage was, nobody got a mortgage under 10%, right? Paul Volcker, though, fixed that. The 1990 recession was not quite as severe. This recession in 2000, that was the dot-com bust. The 2010 recession is known as the Great Recession. That was a big one and a bad one and prolonged. So it was almost 2 years. The last one, this little tiny thin one, is the COVID recession. We actually had a recession, but you wouldn't have noticed it because of all the interventions that occurred and everything that was going on around us. So this is the CPI. You can see some patterns. The inflation tends to be going up during recession, then the Fed reacts primarily in order to make jobs occur, and then it goes down, and then it goes back, and it goes down, so it fluctuates. One thing to know about recessions you typically don't know when you're in one. We could be in one now, and we don't know it. The recessions are typically named by a group called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a collection of economists. They're not a government organization, and they're the ones who say, hey, guess what? You were just in a recession. They have not called one yet, but I suspect that we're probably overdue. So the other thing to notice was inflation went way down from the Great Recession. That was the housing bust. And then see this peak after COVID. That's currently what the Fed's having to deal with. Very, very high inflation, and I'll talk about why that came about. This is that PCE. It looks a lot like the other one, except it's less noisy, so the Fed likes it because it's a little less noisy. But you can see the Great Recession here, and you can see that very severe drop in inflation and the big spike that happened after it that the Fed had to respond to. And that's the PPI. Looks a lot like it. I'm just showing you that it exists. Okay, so let's talk about the Federal Reserve and inflation. The Federal Reserve was actually created to prevent runs on banks. So most of you have probably seen this scene on the left, or you will probably this holiday season. This is from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And in that movie, Jimmy Stewart, who plays George Bailey, runs a bank. He runs a local savings and loan. And something happened, I won't spoil it for you, but people got nervous and they worried that the bank didn't have their money. So they did a run on the bank. They said, George, we want our money out now because we're worried you're not going to have it. So there he is dealing with all the townspeople. On the right, that's Samuel Bankman-Fried. He ran a bank, a big crypto bank. A journalist revealed an unfortunate relationship between his bank and a research company that he ran. And so there was a run. Everybody wanted their money out, and he effectively couldn't come up with it, so he's in prison. So that's what happens in those circumstances. The Fed was created in 1913 to address exactly that, runs on banks. There had been several in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and they decided that enough was enough. So Congress created the Fed, the Federal Reserve System, with a dual mandate. There's only two things they're supposed to do. They're supposed to maximize employment and stabilize prices. That's it. The Fed is not a government organization. It is an organization of banks. However, the president nominates the Federal Reserve governors. There are 7 governors. There's a chair. Chair is currently Jerome Powell. The 7 governors are on 14-year terms. That 14-year term is not by accident. They are supposed to span presidents. Because they are supposed to be apolitical, they're supposed to have these long terms. They don't look at any given administration. The chair is on a 4-year term, so the chair often will only work for one president. The president has the right to remove a governor for cause. That has not happened yet. In the spring, it almost did. So the current administration threatened to fire Jerome Powell. You'll find out why in a little while. The bond market around the world freaked out. And so what they learned was, yeah, you could do that, but you can't control the weather, and the economy's like the weather. If you do that, there's going to be severe consequences. So they didn't. They currently are trying to remove one Fed governor. So there's and you'll see why, a move to try and control the Fed. Their primary mechanisms the Fed has, there are 2 big ones: setting of the federal funds rate, which I'll talk about, and my favorite, which is the Fed's balance sheet. So there's the Wizard of Oz. I'm trying to make this slightly fun. So that is the Wizard of Oz after the curtain has been revealed, right? And he says, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. That is actually what the Fed would like. The Fed does not want to be in the spotlight. The Fed doesn't want to be in the news. They would like to just sit behind everything and have everything work. But the curtain's been pulled, and they're in the news. The Fed has these 2 mechanisms, right? The federal funds rate is actually the interest rate that banks charge each other for an overnight loan. So that is effectively to prevent those runs on banks. The old idea was somebody freaks out, wants to go to the credit union, get all their money out, they would have it until people figured out that there was no crisis. The balance sheet is the money that the Fed basically creates by buying treasuries and mortgage-backed securities since the Great Recession. They also sell them. So the Fed controls the amount of money that's kind of out there, which is a big part of inflation. That's the federal funds rate. So you can see that it was going up until the Great Recession, and then it was a bad one. So they lowered it, and they effectively lowered it to zero. Around 2018, they started raising it again, and then COVID happened, and they pushed it again down to zero, because that's what you do when you're the Fed and there's a crisis. Then they have now been raising it, and that is in response to that post-COVID inflation. It got out of hand, and they figured they needed to drive it down, so they raised rates, and now they're in this position, as you'll see, of trying to figure out what to do next. That is the Fed's balance sheet. This is to demonstrate my geekiness. This is my favorite graph that I do when I present these things. So this is the amount of money that the Fed has effectively created through buying. The Fed's the only entity that can actually create money and remove money. So they do it by buying treasuries. They can have a meeting and say, guess what? There's $1 trillion more, and they buy treasuries, right? So here was, oh, it's blocking the years. Oh, well. This is around 2008. We were sitting at about $1 trillion. That 2007 through 2009 recession was actually a liquidity-driven recession. Recessions aren't all the same. This one was a seizing up of the banks because everybody discovered that there were a lot of speculative housing, particularly here in Florida, that didn't have real people, real money behind it. The banks just stopped lending, right? And they stopped lending for everybody. They stopped lending for businesses. There was a meeting. I think the statement, it's a good statement for me. The statement was, if we don't do something by Monday, the world will go back to the 16th century in terms of the economy, right? We'll be trading chickens for a soda. So they said, we got to create a lot of money. So they doubled the money supply. And they gave it to the banks, and they said, you have to lend this. You're not going to be able to keep it. You have to lend it. And they did. So over time, they did what's called quantitative easing. If you want to know what quantitative easing is, this is it. They basically keep buying treasuries, and they put more money in the economy, more money to prime everything. We go along, about 2018, they decided we better try and take some of it back. So they start selling off treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and then there was a thing in something called the repo market, which I had no idea existed until that moment. But it was a crisis, so they started buying them again, and then COVID happened. So what do you do if you're the Fed and there's a crisis? They put $2 trillion more out there into the economy. And then they kept buying and buying and buying until we end up in 2022 with probably about $8.5 trillion out there. Then they've started to try and take it back. So they're pushing that federal funds rate down, and they're trying to take some of this money back, because they were concerned from the get-go, way back at this time, they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to take it back. Too much money out there. Let's see. Oops. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this. This is just to show you that it turns out we learned during the Great Recession that the Fed has a bunch of different levers to pull. They don't pull them. They pulled most of them back in the Great Recession. So there's a lot. This is not working well for me. Am I supposed to point it where am I supposed to point this? Okay. So remember that the Fed has this dual mandate, price stability and maximize or full employment. So what is price stability? The Fed has a target. It's called the forward guidance. So when you hear that word, what it is the Fed trying to hit 2%. They don't want inflation to be zero. Zero inflation's not good. Negative inflation's not good. It might be good for you temporarily, but in the end, it's not good for you. So they try to hit 2%. We're at about 3%. That's where we are. We were at 9% in June of 2022. So it's come down. The current debate among economists is whether 2% should be the target. Why 2%? Well, for one reason, it's a target. And if you don't keep the target, then it's not a target, right? So you'll always be moving it. So they still have it at 2%, but they're willing to make a move if it's not down to 2%, which is what they've recently done. Maximize full employment. This is often expressed as unemployment. there are at least 6 measures of unemployment. The one that you typically hear is called U3. And that is the number of people who are unemployed but looking for work divided by the number of people who are unemployed but looking for work and the number employed. So it is a very specific type. Sometimes they focus on different ones. U3 is typically sitting at around 4.3%, but it's ticking up, and that's a concern. So there's no agreement on what number represents full employment, but I don't think anybody thinks it's below 3.5%, and nobody thinks it's above 5%. It's somewhere in there, right? You don't want unemployment to be zero. It can't, because there's always people moving around through the economy. It's a dynamic thing. So nobody ever expects it to be zero. We will never have a situation where everybody's employed. So this is what unemployment looks like. It typically goes up during a recession, and then it comes down as the Fed responds by lowering interest rates. You can see that in the Great Recession, it went way up. We lost a bunch of construction workers, who, by the way, have never fully come back. And then COVID, there was a shutdown, so it spiked. It was a big deal. People were at home, stuck. If you were a server in a restaurant, you lost your job. The place was closed. So the Fed said, we're going to create a bunch of money. And unlike the Great Recession, that Congress made a bunch of mechanisms to put that money into your pocket. Your pocket, my pocket, your pocket. So now all of a sudden you're in the shutdown. You've got money in your pocket, but you can't go out and spend it till the shutdown was lifted. Then you could go out and spend it. That's where we are with inflation. That's the origin of that big spike in inflation. This is the relationship between unemployment and inflation. They usually kind of go opposites. The concern for the Fed is recent. So if you look at unemployment, this is the CPI, it's ticking up. It's made a hook and it's ticking up, and unemployment is ticking up. So this is a problem for the Fed, because now these things are moving in the same direction, and that's not what they want. So they have these two levers. If they push interest rates up to make the inflation go down, or they could push interest rates down to make employment go up and unemployment go down, right? That's what they do. Threats of stagflation. We don't currently have it, but what is stagflation? That is a circumstance where prices are going up, which they are, unemployment is going up, which it is, but gross domestic product is flat or negative. Currently, GDP, the last print came in pretty good. I think it was like 3.8%, which is good. But you don't want stagflation. Japan has been struggling with stagflation since the 90s. It's hard to get out of. And the US, the last time we had it, some of you may remember, it was in the 70s. Nixon tried to do wage and price controls, which were an utter disaster. You can't do that. You'll see why in a minute. So we don't have it, but the Fed is concerned about it. What is the Fed to do? So either way, they're going to go against their dual mandate, right? Those two numbers, those two indexes are going in ways that if either thing they do with the federal funds rate, they're going against that dual mandate. Okay, this doesn't really go, but it's almost Halloween, and I figured you needed a picture at this point. So this is from Ghostbusters, and if anybody remembers Ghostbusters, they had this kind of ray that they would use to get the ghosts. And I can't remember his name. Does anybody remember his name? Anyway, he says at the beginning, don't cross the streams. I don't know what happens when you cross the streams, right? But at the end, there's this giant ghost, and they decide they have to cross the streams. So there you go. They're crossing the streams. It's kind of like the dilemma the Fed has. What do? We don't know what happens when we do this. So what is the Fed concerned about with jobs? These are jobs numbers. You would have typically gotten this report last Friday. It's the first Friday of each month, but the BLS is closed due to the shutdown, so we don't have that number. But the numbers have been actually trending down. This is actually year over year, the number, if you do follow this. The number is usually month over month, but I'm doing year over year because this number is not good, but this number is really bad. So typically the Fed will do that jobs number report the first Friday of each month. The following month, they announce revisions. What's been happening is that it turns out that these jobs reports are from a survey. They survey businesses. And just like any other survey that I'm happy to come and talk to you about if you would like, response rates are going down. So the BLS is working with less data and less data. As time goes on, people after the fact send in a report, and they have to do a lot of forecasting. So the forecasts have been noisy, but the last revision was really bad. So it says there were 911,000 fewer jobs than they thought there were. So the feds decided the jobs market's not good. This is employment change by industry. What you can see is most sectors of the economy are actually down. The thing that's kind of holding us up is healthcare, private education and health, but it's really health. And there are indications that that's making a turn. So once all those bars go to the left, then we're losing jobs, going negative. So the Fed met September 16th and 17th. If you were a geeky person like me, you were listening to it as it came out. And they decided that the weakness of the job market outweighed the inflation risk. So they cut the federal funds rate by 1/4 point. They said they hope that the rise in inflation will be a one-time event. Anybody who kind of follows this, after COVID, there was clearly inflation. They said, well, maybe it's transitory. That was the word, transitory, meaning it'll go up and then it'll come down. It didn't. The Fed was late to raising interest rates, and they tried to catch up, and they did. They brought inflation down, but that makes me think, I don't know why you'd think the current situation is transitory. The stock market had already baked in this 1/4 point cut, and the stock market has already baked in 2 more 1/4 point cuts this year, right? There's 2 more meetings the end of the year, and everybody, the markets, S&P, all the indexes expect that the Fed's going to lower interest rates by 2 more, right? So baked in, I'm always amused the way we talk about the stock market as a person, but it's really how they talk about it. So the expectation is that there's going to be 2 more cuts. If there aren't, you should be ready to see some reaction in your portfolios that you have. Okay, so there's some other pressures on the Fed. There are political pressures, and then there's tariffs. This is a pie chart showing you a breakdown of what the federal government spends each year by category. So we all know, by the way, that the federal government for many, many years has spent more money than it has received every single year. So it's like your credit card, and you just get a raise on your limit, and you just keep putting money on your credit card. So you can see that the federal government spends about 22% of its budget on Social Security, 14% on Medicare, about 13% on Medicaid and some other things, 13% on national defense. 14% of our budget goes to pay the interest on our debt, right? We don't get to borrow money for free. The people who borrowed it are pension funds, other kinds of big funds, other countries. So we have to pay interest on our debt. How do you get out of that? Well, you could do like a household does. You could do some belt tightening, right? So that you could pay down the principal. If you did that, what are you going to take away from, right? You've seen these exercises. You're going to take away from defense, can't touch Social Security, not a good idea to touch Medicare. There is some indication they're going to touch Medicaid. That's in here. So that's one way. Another way is you grow yourself out of it, right? If you were in a household, you could get a second job, make some money, pay down that principal, right? The other way you can get out of it is by having interest rates go down. Most of us don't get to call the credit card company and say, you know what, I don't really like my 15% interest rate. I would like to have a 14% rate. They're going to tell you to go jump in a lake, right? But the government is trying to tell the Fed to lower interest rates. That's where the pressure is. Why? Because if we actually lowered interest rates to near zero, to like a 1/4 point, this bottom line shows you we would still in 2035 be paying 14% of our budget on the debt. If on our current path, we stayed here, we're going to go up to about 15%. If the Fed has to tighten because inflation gets out of hand and we have to go to like 8.5%, we will be spending like 20% of our budget on the interest that we pay. So there's pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates because that makes it so that amount of money we pay on the debt doesn't really go down, but it's less, okay? Then there's tariffs. So the tariffs are kind of complicated. We have always had tariffs. Since this country was created, we have charged tariffs to other countries charge us tariffs. I think that it is fair to say that at the beginning of this year, if you kind of looked at the situation, probably this country was paying more tariffs on balance than other countries. You could say that we were getting taken advantage of. So whatever your view on that, the reaction was to just scuttle all the agreements and redo them, right? So you know that there's been a lot of activity. It's hard to predict. It's also a little complicated because the US has a different role than most countries. We're the nation, we're the kind of the banker for the world, right? We do a lot of things. That's tied up in it. But currently, there's about a 30% tariff on most Chinese goods. That's where we currently sit. With Mexico, it's 0 on items that fall under the USMCA. I can't remember what it stands for, but Canada and Mexico have an agreement on some things. So you're not paying a lot of money on avocados because avocados are covered, but car parts aren't. So for some things coming from Mexico, it's 25%, from Canada, all the way up to 50% for steel and aluminum. Who pays? Who pays the tariff? I guarantee you that the US government is receiving the tariff. That's a given. There's 3 options. The exporter pays. So if you're getting an air fryer, the manufacturer in China that makes the air fryer could take some of that tariff and eat it. They're not. There's no indication that that's happening at all. They're passing it on. The importer, Walmart, for example, could pay some of that tariff. There is evidence that they are doing that, and in a lot. There's also evidence that you, the consumer, when you buy the air fryer, are also paying some of the tariff. So as the tariff situation goes on, the question is how much of this stuff gets passed on. There will be extreme pressure for those importers to pass more of it on to consumers, and then it'll show up in that CPI. This is showing the relationships between tariffs and inflation. This is that CPI that I was talking about. This is the thing that right here where this arrow's pointing, this is where the Fed said that inflation was transitory. At that moment, inflation had gone up. The Fed said, maybe it's not going to be so bad, but it kept going up. So they started increasing that federal funds rate. When you increase it, it makes things more expensive. People stop buying. So inflation has come down, but now it's ticking back up. So nobody really knows where it's going to land. People are making a lot of guesses. Okay, but what about consumer sentiment? Because that's what this talk's about. I'll make it, you'll see. Okay. Before I go into that, one more thing. If any of you, I don't know, I don't do a lot of podcasts, but there's a good podcast on NPR called Planet Money. They're really nice, very accessible. Episode 216 is titled 4 Drinking Buddies Save Brazil. Okay? So in the 1950s, the government of Brazil wanted to build a bunch of buildings, but they didn't have money, so they decided to print it. They printed a bunch of money. And when you print a bunch of money without anything else, it's going to cause inflation, and it did. By 1985, they had freezing prices, didn't work. You can't freeze things. People go to the black market, all kinds of results. By 1990, there was 80% inflation per month, daily increases at the store, 2,000% interest on bank accounts. Government decreases the printing, freezes a bunch of money. The president was impeached. A new president was appointed. He hires a new finance minister who hires 4 economists who were drinking buddies when they were at the Catholic University in Rio. This is economists saved the world. So what was their plan? Their plan was they realized that there's a very, very strong relationship between the perception of the consumers, everybody in this room, and money, right? Inflation is as much about people's expectations about what's happening as anything else. Tariffs is different. Tariffs is another thing. But they decided they're just going to stop printing cruceros. That was the money that they had. They balanced the budget. They told the government, you got to live off what you bring in. And then they tried to stabilize the faith in money by creating a new virtual currency called the unit of real value. They basically had the central bank show people what's actually happening. Rather than thinking about the cruceros, which were like a wheelbarrow full of money, think about the URV. They managed to get wages, taxes, and store prices listed in URVs instead of cruceros. And then they basically start to talk about everything in URVs. And in July 1994, they made a swap. They got rid of the crucero and they created the real, which is what they use now. And they said it's 1 real per 1 URV. So it was a move to try and switch the way people thought about money, because the way people were thinking about money had a lot to do with inflation. So there is a relationship between consumer expectations and inflation. Some of you have saw the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I love that show. And this is Mary Tyler Moore in the opening credits when she's in a store and she's deciding whether to buy this package of meat, and she rolls her eyes and throws it into the cart. But when consumers expect prices to rise, they start doing weird things. Sometimes they'll start pulling purchases forward, right? Because they think prices are going to go up. And you end up in this kind of spiral where then inflation goes up and then they are going to go up more, right? So inflation is about this feedback loop. What is consumer sentiment then, you ask? It's a survey-based measure. It's relatively inexpensive compared to other measures. It was created as a barometer of public opinion about the economy back in the 40s. The University of Michigan did that. It's designed to predict consumer spending. Consumer spending accounts for about almost 70% of GDP. You and I buying things is a big part of this economy. So when we're not buying, it's not good. So consumer sentiment was designed to predict that. There's actually two. It's a little confusing. There's consumer sentiment from the University of Michigan. They do it nationally, about 500 surveys a month. It's changed a lot in the way they do it. And then consumer confidence, which is from the Conference Board. They do about 3,000 a month online. This shows you the relationship between these two. They kind of move together, but you can see that there are some points, because of the questions and what's going on, there's a bit of a divergence. These are the questions, which I'm not going to go through in great detail, but each of them has 5 questions. 2 current conditions questions and 3 future expectations questions. For Conference Board, they focus a lot on jobs, which is an important thing now. Jobs and people's perceptions of job availability and whether business conditions are good. The Michigan Index looks at business conditions, but it also looks at personal finances, and this one, overall buying conditions. And the question is, do you think now is a good or bad time for people to buy major household items? That'd be like a car, or refrigerator, or a washing machine. So that is a measure of people's perceptions of inflation. If people think that it's not a good time, then that's problematic. So we do the Michigan Index for Florida. We've done it since the mid-80s. It has changed a lot in the way we do it because of the nature of the survey business. But I'll show you another geeky slide here. This is a graph we used to update. We don't anymore because there's no point. This shows you the relationship between cell phones and landlines. And basically what's happened over time is there's virtually no households that have only a landline. Every household has either cell phone only or a landline and cell. So when we do phone surveys, we're calling you on your cell phone, which is getting very hard to do. That is the relationship between our index and Michigan. You can see that we generally move the same direction. 2 completely different organizations measuring it, one in Florida, one nationally. We're pretty close, but you can see that there are some divergences. What drives consumer? It's actually sentiment. Things like, that's the problem with it. Consumers aren't really the best judges of the economy. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait, they freaked out. When gas prices hit $4, they freaked out. Unemployment, when stock market crashes, they freak out. So the problem with consumer confidence and consumer sentiment is it's very susceptible to things that aren't economic, right? This is showing you the relationship between consumer sentiment and inflation. By and large, when inflation is down, sentiment is up. This is the buying index for the Michigan Index. It's showing you that buying index related to inflation, and it's getting a little noisy here at the end. This is our index related to inflation. So here, inflation is going up, and consumer sentiment was actually going up. So you're getting some odd things, but the Fed actually looks at these indexes because they want to have any kind of data that tells them what might be happening with inflation. And with a shutdown, now there's even less data. This is showing you the stock market and consumer sentiment. So the dotted line is the S&P. Generally speaking, they kind of move together. There has been a divergence here at the end. You see the S&P kind of going up and the consumer sentiment going down. This is a CNN article. I thought the headline was pretty telling. Consumer sentiment is back to near record lows, but Americans are still spending. Here's why. This, in case you didn't know, the S&P for many years has been dominated. Actually, it's since 2023, when ChatGPT first came out, it has been dominated by 7 companies. And that top line is NVIDIA, which makes the GPUs that run a lot of AI stuff. So what's happening is the S&P goes up because these companies are throwing trillions of dollars into AI purchasing. And what this has led to is what's called a K-shaped economy. So K-shaped economy, which we're in, means that 80% of the country is pretty kind of flat or bad, but the upper 20% is doing pretty well. And that upper 20% is what's doing a lot of the buying right now and keeping things afloat. So where is it going? Personally, I think we're overdue for a recession. Recessions occur with some kind of cyclical nature. I think we're overdue. The COVID recession was artificial, and so I think we're probably headed for a recession, but who knows? Questions? That was a lot. That was a lot, sorry. There's a question in the back.
Start with you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a international healthcare worker.
Mhm.
I work out of this country quite a bit, and I was in 7 different countries this last year. When I was in Malawi, the economy crashed. Their currency became zero. World Bank would not recognize it. So what I see when I travel around the world is the representation of the US dollar.
Mhm.
When I was in England, their currency has decreased. Now, we're talking about this sort of in a encapsulated way for the US,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of talk out there about the value of the US dollar now and how that would affect us economy-wise. And what do you have to say about BRICS that's getting more and more members
You mean
to
like the
devalue the US dollar?
Brazil, Russia? Well, I don't know about Russia. Russia's kind of out of it, right? Yeah, so I mentioned somewhere in this lengthy talk that the US has a special role, right? So the big thing is that the dollar is the reserve currency. I don't know if you've been hearing, but some people think the Chinese yuan, they're trying to make a move to be the reserve currency or at least share that status. There are discussions that crypto, like Bitcoin, could become a reserve currency because the US all of a sudden doesn't look to be as stable as it used to be. We're the reserve currency because, of course, the US economy is going to be there, right? But there are questions about that. I think the dollar is currently weakening. That's good for exporters, right? Because it makes it easier for them to export. It's not good in other ways. And there are plenty of countries, I don't know about Malawi, but there are plenty of countries that tie their currency to the dollar. So there are a lot of effects on the world when the US dollar goes down or up. I mean, we're in that place. We don't know what a world looks like without the US being the banker of the world. And that's why Beaver tries to be apolitical, right? And I am, but that's why when you threaten to fire the chair of the Fed, it has such a reaction around the world. They're like, what's going on? We're all linked to you, and now you're doing this thing that seems to be in your best interest, but not everybody else's, right? So the Fed is trying to remain hands-off, and there's a lot of pressure. Yeah.
One of the financial columnists that I read points out that the AI industry and their big data centers are overspending, that
Probably.
their revenue, their projected revenue, will not possibly meet their debt load. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. You know, I was on an AI task, 2 AI task forces at UF. So I do believe that AI is here. I do believe that our students need to learn about it. I think that there are responsible ways of using it. There are irresponsible ways of using it. In the kind of economics field, I think there have been big questions upon exactly what you just said, whether there's going to be, the thing is, people know that AI is going to do something, but they don't know what. And so the question is, okay, we've demonstrated that you can make it and you can make it big, but so what? Where's the so what, right? It hasn't really happened yet. So, but all the companies are investing because it's like the internet, right? That was an inflection point. You better get in because something's going to happen and you don't know what it is, but if you're not in, you're going to be behind, right? Good example that, what's a good example of that? Kodak. Does anybody hear about Kodak anymore, right? We all grew up with Kodak. Kodak doesn't make anything that sells anymore because they didn't get on the digital bandwagon, right? They were selling film, right? So I think that's the attitude. You just got to keep piling money in, and so they do. But it's unclear what's going to happen from that. Well, some people, yeah, the dot-com bubble, right? It was a lot of paper money. Well, I think most of us have lived through that. You had investments. Some of the investments were things that didn't actually make anything. You could argue that AI is that. I will tell you, I teach classes, I teach students. It would be a disservice. I am not a person who tells students at the beginning of the semester not to use it. I don't believe in that. I tell them to use it, but I say, you use it, but I love to refer to myself as a primate, because I am. I am a primate reading something made by a machine. So at a certain point, you have to be sensitive to the fact that I'm going to get annoyed if you send me a big, long document that you've not read, right? So there's a way of doing it. The other is, I think at the university, we need to look at AI as a way of making people's minds bigger. Most people think of it as offloading what you don't want to do onto it. That's not it. That's going to make us all lazy. It's really about using it in order to make ourselves bigger, and that's a conversation that's not really happening.
Question on Zoom.
Sure.
Can you explain?
Oh,
Yeah.
Can you explain how Janet Yellen got so wrong the inflation coming out of the pandemic? I know the pandemic was a little unique, but isn't their research better? And I realized she wasn't at the Fed during the pandemic. She was running the Treasury. Yep. Well, it's the last sentence. 2 different jobs. So she was running the Fed. When you're running the Treasury, it's a different job with different responsibilities. Interestingly, I did a little tour as a program officer at the National Science Foundation, and the guy next to me, in my office next to me, was John Yellen, who is her brother, who's an archaeologist. So we've got a lot of talks together. I just had to mention that. I think the Fed also got it. Well, I told you they got it wrong. Everybody said that they should have been raising rates, and they just didn't. And they waited, and they waited. And I don't know. I don't know if there was political pressure. Oddly, if you listen to the transcript, you won't. But if you listen to the transcript of Jerome Powell after the last meeting, he made one statement that bothered me. He talked about the stock market. He said the stock market has baked in these cuts. He's not supposed to look at the stock market, ever. So I don't know what happens in that room, but I think they're talking about other things other than jobs and inflation.
Hi.
Hi.
In the late 70s, I was working for the Census Bureau and their Foreign Trade Division, and they were responsible for putting together the balance of trade statistics. It seems to me that there are all types of indices that are put together by various organizations within the government and outside the government, and it just seems that it's not necessarily how you'd start a data system from scratch, and that it might be there might be a better way of informing consumer sentiment, as well as perceptions in various parts of the economy of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a fantastic observation. So the gist of it is all these things that we look at have emerged over time, right? Somebody creates a new index, Census Bureau decides to create another index, right? So they're all over the place. And your point is, if you were designing this from the ground up, would you do it that way? I think everybody would say no. Just so you know, one of the things that the current administration is thinking about doing is redoing some indices. That gets people nervous, right? So if you redo the jobs report and all of a sudden it comes out looking very favorable, what's the result? But there is a good argument for modernizing some of these things. Regarding the public-private, I think there do need to be private sources. So no administration can do anything about the ADP report. They can't do anything about, well, they could. The state could shut us down, but we do consumer sentiment. Michigan does it. So there are private data indices that come out, and I think those are good to be there kind of as a balance. But there is no doubt that things need to be modernized. The Census Bureau, Census Bureau itself is in great need of modernization. So I agree with you, but I would not like it if all the indices that we ever looked at were created by the federal government. There has to be some balance. Yeah.
And on the economy of Florida,
Sure.
and on an even more local level, what are the implications for this checking into Alachua County and Gainesville or wasteful spending?
Yeah. You're talking about Florida Doge, right? Florida, so once I saw Doge at the federal level, I pretty much knew there would be a Florida Doge, and there is. So they're looking for inefficiency and fraud. You asked about Florida. Florida has been, so Florida is a state that we have made efforts to bring other kinds of business here, but we are still extremely reliant on people who visit here and people who move here, right? And, visitors and people moving here fluctuates. In the Great Recession, it stopped, right? Nobody has any money. They're not going to Disney World, and they're certainly not moving because they can't sell their house in order to move to Florida. So we're a state that's very dependent on that kind of flow. It's been pretty good. We've been doing pretty well for the last few years. But, everything comes down, right? So I think the expectation is that the Florida economy is going to take a bit of a hit. Also, if you look at the big, beautiful bill, not in a partisan way, but if you look at it, it's very clear that states are going to have to pick up a lot of the burden for Medicaid, right? So that's going to shift a lot of burden onto states. Florida's the third largest state, so we're going to pay it. Alachua County, Gainesville, it's the university, right? It's the 800-pound gorilla. The university drives the economy here. So there are a lot of pressures on universities. I will say, at least in terms of enrollment, UF is in a good situation because we are very clearly the premier, I don't know what your allegiances are, but we are the premier university in the state. So all the students, if they don't go to Duke, they want to come here, right? So actually, UF has been having an issue with over-enrollment. They have been targeting enrollment about 6,500, and it's been coming in well over 7,000 every year. So they would like it to be less. So I think UF, at least in terms of enrollment's okay. The research dollar thing's an issue. That's still kind of being worked out. But I think generally UF is in pretty good shape for the moment. And so that translates to things being pretty good for the county. I don't know about what was it, 84 million that was overspent? I don't know what that was on. Maybe some of you do.
Any other questions?
Here's one up front here.
Oh, okay. Anybody in the front there?
Yep,
Oh.
right here.
Why does the Fed consider 2% inflation stabilizing prices?
Because as I said, you don't want inflation to be zero. They think 2% is healthy. And I will tell you that during the aftermath of the Great Recession, I was giving this talk in multiple places. And when I got to inflation, what I said was, why isn't inflation hitting 2%? They were below, and they wanted it to be higher. They want it at 2%. They don't want it at 3. They don't want it at 1. So I don't know. If you get this question about what should the target be, I don't think 1% is good. I don't think so. That's not a sign of a healthy economy. Those that don't want it to be 0, and they don't want it going down. So you don't want disinflation. So economic principles would generally tell you that you want it to be non-zero. The Fed thinks it's 2. Other economists are arguing with them, saying, why not 3? That's what they're saying, where it currently is. So it's counterintuitive, but they never have wanted it to be 0. Yeah. I'm not a Fed governor.
I think there's a Zoom
Okay.
question or two, if we can
Okay.
get those, wherever they are. June Brady. Oh, Eric Hansen, whoever it was, we're not seeing it here.
Okay.
Yeah, she can go to chat. Or
Oh,
Yeah.
here it is. Okay.
where is it?
2 questions right there.
Right there.
Please comment on how changes in survey methods affect the accuracy of consumer economic indicators like consumer sentiment. Okay, I mentioned this with the BLS. Consumer sentiment is a survey-based measure, and we do it in the month. So we want it to reflect the month. So we got to get all the responses within the month. That's hard. We used to do landlines. It worked pretty well for a while. We always had issues with response rates. So what's a response rate? It's the number of people who respond out of those who are eligible. And there used to be rules about that everybody's thrown out the window. When landlines started becoming rare, we switched to cell phones. That worked for a while, but all of you, including me, have some pretty good things on your phone that allows you to prevent calls from people you don't know. So that has been a problem. Again, I'm happy to come talk about it if you're not bored by it, but the survey industry is very, very increasingly moving to panels. So a panel is a set of people that I have pre-selected to represent some representation. They've agreed from time to time to be interviewed. And so our survey, like Michigan's, is now a mix of a panel and calls that we make. So yeah, it's a problem. And we also, by the way, when you do a survey, generally things don't come in a representative way. So there's a thing the US government does, the Federal Census Bureau does, called the American Community Survey. Took the place of the long form that some of us used to get. That is the benchmark by which everybody adjusts surveys. And then how is shrinkflation reflected in the CPI? I think they mean like now when you get a pack of Ruffles potato chips and you open it, there's like half the number. I don't think it is. I think that is probably the price of the bag of potato chips, and then they just figured out a way of adjusting. I mean, that is a way I think that the importers are able to not pass that on to you directly, but they're doing it indirectly. So rather than making you pay more for the bag of chips, they're just going to give you half the bag.
Okay, please, I think we have to go. It's an hour. So thank the speaker, and if anybody has further questions, they can come up
I
later.
think my email may be on there. You
And
feel
yeah,
free to email me.
thank you very much, Chris.
Yep.